We've heard about the live cattle export ban affecting farmers. I thought I'd take the opportunity while I have John Bethel, a third-generation cattleman, sitting with me, to give you his take on not only how it affected himself but his fellow cattlemen. John, do you mind having a talk about that?
Yeah, I'm prepared to sort of run you through the scenario as it unfolded. Like in my situation, I was no different to a lot of people. Most of us have interest payments due at the end of June, and in some instances principal and interest. So, and the majority of my income at that time was from the live export trade. And I had 500 head of cattle contracted onto Wellards, through Wellards onto their boats. And I think it was around about the 3rd or 4th of June. And I had already, at this stage there were rumours that things weren't good.
And what year was this?
2011. Mm-hmm. There were rumours that there was, Animals Australia had some footage, and there was all sorts of rumours flying around. But at that stage, the money was really good. It was probably the best money that I'd ever contracted cattle at. I think it was $1.95 for steers and $1.75 for heifers, which was terrific money at that time. And I had the steers in the yard. I had the helicopter muster them into the yard. I drafted them, and they were in the paddock. And the next morning, I was going to muster the heifers, and then they would have been put into the holding paddock. And I think the following day, the day after that, the trucks were going to come and pick them up, and I was going to load them out. 500 head. We're going out to go over the scales at Charters Towers. On the night of the 4th, or the night that I mustered the steers and put them in the paddock, that night I got a phone call from the agent to say that Wellards, that all hell had broken loose.
And who are Wellards, just for those that don't know?
Wellards were probably the biggest live exporters into Asia at that stage. They owned a lot of their own ships. And they also had the agency side of it as well. So I had these cattle contracted through Wellards, and that afternoon Ludwig announced the suspension of the trade. 10 o'clock that night I got a phone call from the agent to say that Wellards had torn up my contracts. One lot of cattle had been mustered. They were in the yard. I had principal and interest due at the end of June, and all of a sudden we had no industry. And it collapsed the market Australia-wide. It cascaded all the way to Tasmania. There were people had to shoot cattle in the yards, in paddocks. There were cattle that were in transit, that were caught on trucks. There were cattle that were in export yards in the Northern Territory and over in WA and places like that were stranded for 6 to 8 weeks. I know of one exporter who was feeding 2 semi-loads of hay a day to keep cattle alive that had nowhere to go. The property owners wouldn't take them back, and they had nowhere to go. I know of plane loads of speculators who flew to do those export yards in the Northern Territory.
What do you mean, speculators?
People have to secure cattle at a very cheap price.
So buyers, yeah. Yeah,
people who are in the market, I call them sharks. Those cattle, as I said, mine were contracted at $1.95 for the steers and $1.75 for the heifers. And I know that people were buying cattle out of the yards, out of those export yards, for $1 a kilo. You do the maths, that's a big loss. It bankrupted some of those exporters.
So who was behind all of this?
Animals Australia and RSPCA. I mean, it was a dog act, really. I mean, nobody condones animal cruelty, but there was so much dodgy stuff went on with that a bloody business show. I know industry insiders who reckons they will tell you that it was a setup, it was put up.
And why do you think Animals Australia and RSPCA did all this? What was their motive?
They want to stop all people eating meat, firstly, but secondly, they don't believe that anybody has the right to make a living out of an animal, to use them for anything at all. They should be just turned free and left to their own devices. They're sentient animals, we're told.
And that sounds very much like a Greens Labor thought process.
It's a thought process of someone who knows jack shit about the land. That's all I can tell you. People have been eating meat since they were in the caves.
And there's also, I believe, the video that was circulating through Animals Australia, was it? That was actually had nothing to do with the end location of where these beasts were going.
They certainly weren't Australian cattle, and they were most likely Indonesian cattle, local cattle. The meatworks involved in that video were backyard meatworks that killed maybe a dozen a month, only little run-down shows. There was footage in the actual bloody business video, if you remember back to it, that showed all these cattle feeding in a feedlot with all the ear tags in them, with insinuating that they were next in line to be treated in this appalling way. And those cattle in that footage belong to ACC and AA Company, which are two of the biggest exporters of cattle to Indonesia. It turns out the ABC used 5-year-old file footage. Those cattle weren't next in line to have anything done to them. That footage was 5 years old. It was really, really dishonest.
So following on from that, that's when the banks started to knock on everybody's doors?
Well, almost everybody that would have defaulted on their loans who had interest or principal and interest, like I had principal and interest due at the end of that month, in June, because end of June's generally most people have got an interest payment due at the end of June. The cattle market collapsed. You couldn't sell the cattle. You couldn't even give them away, and it didn't rally around again until September. So it was September before cattle started to move again. By that time, southern states had been flooded with northern cattle. All of the Channel Country in Queensland, anywhere there was a paddock where they could stick a few head in and fatten it, had cattle, they were bulging at the seams because they had nowhere to go. So it collapsed. The entire beef industry collapsed because of it. And when I eventually sold cattle and was able to make my interest payment, by that stage the bank had put me into asset management, along with a whole heap of others.
So just for the people that don't know, asset management means?
Means you defaulted. They've defaulted you on your loans, and there was a hell of a lot of people got put in all at the same time, and that coincided with cattle starting to sell again. I mean, I was actually able to make my payment in September, but steers I had contracted at $1.95, I sold for $1.50, $1.55. Then you've got to take all of your expenses off the top of that, your freight, yard fees, all the rest of it. So I ended up losing the best part of 50 to 60 cents a kilo on the steers, and the heifers were completely unsaleable. I couldn't sell them again. I couldn't sell them for about another 6 or 8 months.
So the irony of it is that Animals Australia and RSPCA wanted live cattle export bans stopped based on an incorrect video. But the irony is that we've ended up seeing all these cattle suffering because they were put into conditions that they shouldn't have been in for any length of time.
It was the most perverse outcome that I've ever seen. For an organisation whose very existence is around the welfare of animals, they caused so much suffering to animals that my mind boggled at the stupidity of what they did. They created a catastrophe. And
so what was the human toll on that?
Oh, there were suicides, there were family breakups, there's heaps of properties that I know of where the kids are gone, mum and dad are running the show. That's if mum and dad are still together. If mum and dad aren't still together, well, dad's running on his own.
Unbelievable. John, thank you very much for sharing that with us, because in all of my years of following this and social media and trying to look for answers and just a clear story, that you just gave it. Thank you.